Perfect. All right. Good morning. Hello, everyone. I've been in Austria now for the past 2 months, so it's nice to get away for a little while and to get out of the field, because it was a good day to not be working in the field yesterday, one of the hottest days of the summer. This actually is a very fitting progression, because I kind of pick up with the next stage of urban renewal in New Orleans and what happens with slum clearance in the 1930s, which a lot of my work hinges on. So thank you very much for having me here today. And I'm going to try to draw together a few different projects in this presentation today, all of which use historical archaeology to look at inequality, environmental precarity, and injustice. Some have more direct connections to these issues, some are more indirect or implicit, but all of them utilize material culture and historical documents in concert together, whether the city itself is material culture or the objects produced and used and discarded by people who live in the city. I hope I can map out some of the connections in the sometimes disparate work I'll bring together here. So since 2005, any conversation about environmental precarity in New Orleans hinged on Hurricane Katrina and the failures of engineering it triggered, which in turn led to much of the city being flooded. And of course, now, just in the past year, we have a new hurricane to speak about as well, Hurricane Ida, which resulted in widespread electrical power outages, leaving the city and its surroundings a patchwork of light and darkness for days, occasionally weeks afterwards. Both made apparent the myriad of techno-political networks that allow the contemporary city to function: flood walls, canals, streets, sewerage pipes, electrical transmission lines, cables, and wireless signals. And of course, the aftermaths of these storms were dramatically different. While both exposed patterns of longstanding environmental racism in housing, Hurricane Katrina laid this bare in a systematic way, and Ida, for me, showed the role of contingency, of chance in structural failures as well. Of course, racial disparities in housing, particularly in housing location, played a big part in why Katrina was so devastating for the city's Black citizens, and why the different plans for rebuilding the city presented in the first years after Katrina were so controversial. This is, after all, the place where efforts to segregate the city, beginning in the early part of the 20th century, pushed Black New Orleanians into the most environmentally precarious parts of the city. The struggles over this continue to this day. I always like to mention the example of the Agriculture Street landfill, this 20th century landfill in what's now the upper ninth ward of New Orleans, a city dump that was notorious for the environmental problems it presented. It was constantly catching fire and emitting these hazardous vapors. And then in the 1970s, in a very thin attempt at environmental remediation, a layer of fill was put over it, and it was developed as a series of Black neighborhoods and a school. And then realized very quickly that there were environmental problems, health problems coming from that. And since the 1990s, there have been efforts to come up with some sort of plan for moving people, relocating them from some of the neighborhoods there, in particular Gordon Plaza. I always like to mention that because it's something showing where this is still going on. There was just a decision last month to fully fund relocation for the people of Gordon Plaza, approved by the city council. We'll see if it actually gets done. People have become very skeptical about any attempt for helping this. So to get back to the archaeology part of what I do, I myself have become interested in how archaeology can be used to study populations that are historically marginalized: the enslaved, immigrants, the working class, people engaged in sex work. While working in the field of cultural resource management, this federally mandated work done for private companies for compliance with the National Historic Preservation Act for federal agencies. My first big urban project in New Orleans was working at the site of the St. Thomas Housing Project. This redevelopment of St. Thomas, one of the first federal housing projects in the city, built in 1939, was controversial. Its rather murky plans for the replacement of low income with mixed income housing seemed to provide little guarantees for former residents for housing, and a plan to make a super Walmart the linchpin of the retail component of the redevelopment added to the controversy, as did the dismissive attitude of the developer doing the redevelopment to concerns about displacement and inequities in rebuilding plans. Of course, this sort of full-scale redevelopment had happened before. The very reason that there was something to find beneath the ground at St. Thomas was that the housing projects had been built as part of the slum clearance movement of the 1930s and 1940s, a predecessor of the urban renewal of the 1960s, where poor neighborhoods had been demolished to make way for the housing projects themselves. Left behind were building foundations, of course, but also wells, outhouse pits, trash pits. In urban settings, these are often filled very quickly, allowing for us to associate what was left behind with very specific past residents, linking with census records and city directories to connect items in the ground to people in the past. The neighborhoods that the housing projects replaced were called slums, but looking at these items, we asked, what did this really mean? Both historical records and archaeology, the material remains themselves, revealed the diversity of some of these neighborhoods in question, whether expressed ethnically or racially or socially or economically. And this led me to question some of this work, the very idea of the slum behind the redevelopments, looking back at the language in which public housing was conceived and in which slum clearance was conceived. It was never put exclusively in terms of simply improving material conditions like sanitation or overcrowding. Planners saw public housing as having the potential to produce normalcy, normal families, normal social relations, but what was the normal that they really meant by that? And what was the nature of the disorder that they thought that they were correcting and eradicating? Of course, in New Orleans in this era, the norm itself was racist, defined by segregation and white supremacy. And the built environment was meant to reproduce this hierarchy. While there were progressive reformers in the first generation of public housing policy in the US, and some of the buildings that were built were well constructed, the decisions that implemented these policies at the local level were embedded in deep inequalities. The housing projects themselves were segregated. There were white-only projects and black-only projects. And of course, we're talking about the postscript or the midpoint of the Jim Crow era in the US, when racist policies were instituted to separate people of color from whites, to deprive them of civil and political rights, and often to literally terrorize. I always like to just give some statistics to give an idea of the effects of Jim Crow in Louisiana. Because between 1888 and 1898, the registration of Black voters in Louisiana dropped by around 90%, from a high of 128,000 just after Reconstruction to only just less than 13,000. And by 1930, getting into the time of the beginning of the housing projects, even after voting rights were extended to women, there were only 2,128 registered voters in Louisiana who were identified as Black. This is an era not just of legal and judicial suppression, but of violence, lynchings, race riots in which Black neighborhoods were targeted, expropriation and devaluing property, segregation as a form of structural violence itself. Other people have told this story, of course, more incisively than I'll ever be able to. Racist housing and education policies, redlining, urban renewal, and so on. So I wanted to look at what archaeology could bring into that conversation by looking at the first 4 of the neighborhoods that were targeted for redevelopment by public housing, the St. Thomas, and just, for example, here's the Belmont Magnolia neighborhood, and the Lafitte and Iberville housing projects. These were constructed as racially segregated pairs. St. Thomas and Iberville is white only, Magnolia and Lafitte is Black only. The neighborhoods that these housing projects replaced on paper were very different. St. Thomas, for instance, was built in what had been part of the Irish Channel of New Orleans, but had become this working class mixed race neighborhood by the 1930s. Iberville, on the other hand, which was located almost precisely situated over the footprint of Storyville, the old red light district, was almost entirely a Black neighborhood when the housing project was constructed, doubling the irony that the project was intended only for whites. So digs at each of these housing project sites produce a wealth of data, though much of it has been little reported so far. And in my own research initially, I tried to integrate this with detailed readings of historical maps and census records, modeling demographics across neighborhoods, and reconstructing models of the neighborhoods. I played around with SketchUp for a while to think about visibility and invisibility in the urban environment, and tried to kind of reconstruct the physical layout of the city and map race and gender and family size and all of these different factors into it with GIS. And that research suggests that each of the neighborhoods predating the projects came to contradict the ideals of a racially segregated and hierarchically ordered city in a different way, with all the different ways revolving around the axis of race, usually with some other factor built into it as well. You know, looking at it from this macro scale, thinking of demographics, you know, the housing projects start to look like a big project of Foucauldian legibility. You know, they're clearing out this very chaotic space and creating these nice wide places to see people and surveil them. And of course, that's kind of the big picture. But what's always fascinating in archaeology, and what I've got much more into now with this work, is looking at how the archaeology enables us to get to these smaller micro histories of individual people who lived in the different neighborhoods, people whose stories are not typically getting recorded in history books, but who are remarkable in their own right. You know, archaeology is very conducive to pulling together those individual stories, a much more ethnographic kind of personal approach. Take, this is a well excavated on the site of the Lafitte Public Housing Project, a well associated with a series of townhouses that were built in the 1830s, 1840s. Once we started looking at the artifacts coming out of the well, we could eventually tie it to the residence there of a woman named Julia Matuire. And this is you can see here, and a kind of interesting little note in the census. She's initially listed as the head of household, and then someone went back through and marked that out and made her the wife, and jumped down to her husband and made him the head of household, and a little reversal there. But Matuire was employed as a midwife. And the artifacts recovered from the well reflected that practice. We could look at documents and see that she was one of the first African-American women who was certified by the Louisiana Board of Health as a midwife in the city. But then we could also see that she was blending the most modern practices of the midwife, the most modern medical practices, with different kinds of folk belief to make the women under her care feel more comfortable. And here's just a couple of artifacts that I always use this to test my students, see if anyone recognizes what this is. There's one person here who might know what that is. And it's nice to have Lori Wilkie here because my research on Matuire drew heavily on her research on African-American midwives in early 20th century Alabama. We have here a raccoon baculum, this token, both sexual health and love and good luck. It can be used for many of these things. And this is a cranial perforator used for fetal extractions, usually only in cases where you're trying to save the life of the mother. And an interesting thing in the upper right corner, this is a brass skirt lifter worn on a chatelaine to sort of cinch up a Victorian skirt with this image of the enclosed hand that I think is significant for a few reasons. We're still doing this kind of work, kind of pulling individual stories out of these projects, because there are still many more housing project redevelopments going on around the city. And all of them fall under the same set of federal laws that actually requires archaeology to be done there. The kind of archaeology done with this sort of technical compliance doesn't always have the opportunity to get at these individual stories. So we've been working with the Housing Authority of New Orleans to actually create public interpretive documents about some of these. I'll just mention the one that I've worked on with Rachel Brunley here in the Neighborhood Story Project, Archaeology of the Gust Homes, another of the later generation of housing projects in the city, where we were able to connect some of the items found to one particular family and put together this booklet telling their story and the story of some other households in the neighborhood. We connected some of the items to the Puckett family, an African-American woman who was a laundress, but saved and bought her own home, and then whose family lost that home prior to the housing projects being constructed. And we were actually able to track down some of their descendants who still had stories of their great-grandmother and this sort of family story of loss about losing the property in some some shady dealings with an insurance company, or on the part of the insurance company. And we had a public event that the Neighborhood Story Project helped to organize, where they were brought together with some of the archaeology and the release of this public interpretive book to go along with it. This work has brought me over and over again to this issue of the devaluation and expropriation of Black wealth in the first half of the 20th century up to the present, essentially. And we've looked at many other projects around the city where this theme ties into it. I think you'll hear a little bit later today about another project that we've done involving the site of Mother Catherine Seal, a spiritual church leader, and the Temple of Innocent Blood in the lower 9th Ward, this area that we all associate with the devastation of Hurricane Katrina. But it has this longer history too of Black property ownership and of people experimenting with ways of organizing space there. And Mother Catherine created this community that was kind of isolated from the racist power structures of the city, and what was then a swampy and undeveloped place on the edge of town. And had this interracial congregation there in the 1920s and 1930s, and then it was disappeared from the landscape after the death of her successor. This kind of connected me to this larger and larger scale issue of displacement. And because I found out in researching the lower 9th Ward that many people who had moved there had been displaced from Fazendaville, this place that was demolished, a free town that was demolished in 1964 to prepare for the Battle of New Orleans sesquicentennial and to create the Chalmette Battlefield National Park. And so it was taken by eminent domain, and many of the people ended up in this environmentally marginal low-lying area as homeowners there because they were displaced from this more valuable riverfront land. This is something that is a story all along the Mississippi River and is tied into these larger movements of populations between the rural and the urban after emancipation. In Louisiana, after emancipation, many of the formerly enslaved moved to cities like New Orleans, and others settled in free towns, sometimes carved out from plantations, often occupying the sites of the old plantation borders. As sugar was industrialized, these former plantations were consolidated. These became large tracts that were very convenient for petrochemical companies to purchase, often employing people from those same small communities, creating these cycles of hazardous environment and devalued property This is the part of Louisiana and the Mississippi River that's sometimes referred to as Cancer Alley, or as my colleague Imani Brown says, Death Alley, because of the high incidence of cancer and systemic health problems. Archaeology is tying back into this in some interesting ways too, because people have realized that these petrochemical companies almost always took over sites of the burial places of formerly enslaved laborers and post-emancipation communities. And now people are realizing that that's a way to push back against petrochemical development and kind of reclaim space for the communities. Because while Louisiana legislators aren't known for being receptive to environmental concerns, you can convince them of the sacredness of burial space. And there are actually very restrictive laws in Louisiana about what can and cannot happen in cemeteries that have been interpreted very robustly now. So I will go through a couple of these to wrap up here, and I can talk more about cemeteries later. But I wanted to very briefly mention, I know I'm a little bit over 20 minutes now, so I'm going to wrap up with this. Since this is something sponsored by the Rachel Carson Center, I wanted to mention another way that we're trying to use archaeological research to connect to these issues of environmental justice and long-term human impacts on the environment. And that is, in archaeology, you get all of these different varieties of data. And one of the varieties of data you get is animal bone. And often it gets kind of quickly analyzed and sits around in storage. So you have these, what we call legacy collections that have not been very well analyzed. We're trying to use legacy collections to look at human impacts through fish. We have a zooarchaeologist who's working with us, and this is really his passion project. He's a guy who loves fish as much as I love pottery. It started out using fish remains from colonial sites up to the present to look at the change in size in fish, to think of how overfishing is affecting resources on the coast. And then we're also doing isotope studies of the fish bone to see how the diets of fish have changed as a way of getting back to the human impacts on the environment that the fish are growing in. We know that overfishing has these sorts of long-term impacts on fish. There's a really well-known case with redfish, when the redfish craze took off in the 1950s as a cuisine. It had this effect within 50 years on the average size of the kind of redfish that you could catch in the Gulf, because they were so rapidly overfished. So we're looking at different archaeological specimens, redfish, black drum, sheep's head, and some of the other brackish water fish that we see a lot in archaeological sites, and trying to chart some of these changes, and now trying to push back this data set for 3,000 years, because in some of the collections we have at UNO, there are bags and bags of fish bones from indigenous archaeological sites from the early woodland era, and from the sites of Big and Little Oak Island that are over in what's now New Orleans East. And so we have this potential method for creating a baseline of data going back from 3,000 years to the present of how humans have kind of influenced the diets and growth patterns of fish. So I will just close by saying that this is what is really the strength of archaeology to me, is this ability to kind of shift scales back and forth, to think about things at the level of the individual and the family, and to tell these sorts of life stories, and then to shift scales and think about change that goes over 3,000 years. Thank you very much for having me. Thanks, Amy and Brian and LMU and the Rachel Carson Center for having me here. And I look forward to speaking with everyone more in the course of the day.